Thank you very much for your interest in this presentation, From Green to Sustainable Supply Chains, a research agenda in the context of Industry 4.0 technologies. My name is Charbel. I'm a global professor at Lincoln International Business School, Department of Management. And if you have any questions or a research idea about the topic of this presentation, if you are thinking about your PhD project, please contact me. The objectives of this presentation is, the first one is to discuss key concepts and selected empirical evidence on green and sustainable supply chain management, evidence which has been produced by my research group on green and sustainable chains. The second objective is to present a potential research agenda for green and sustainable chains in the context of Industry 4.0 technologies. And based on this research agenda, if you are a PhD student, you are thinking about your future career as a researcher, please do contact me. First of all, we need to understand the meaning of supply chain management. So, how can we understand supply chain management? In this slide, you can see that a supply chain is a network of stakeholders, of manufacturers, sometimes suppliers. So you have raw materials and products flowing from suppliers to manufacturers to wholesalers and warehouses, retailers, until they reach consumers. So a supply chain and supply chain management specifically means the coordination of movement of goods and data from suppliers to final customers. You can have either domestic supply chains, so when the flow of these materials and information happens within the same country, or you can have more globalized modern supply chains when a company buys or uses goods or services from overseas in a dynamic global network. So this is a generic definition for supply chain management, but now we will discuss that this generic definition of supply chain management has evolved towards green supply chains. What is the meaning of green supply chain? Well, since the publication of some classic articles which defended the introduction of green environmental issues in the research agenda of operations management, such as this paper published by Angela Klassen in one of the best journals in the world in operations management. So since this kind of publication, we have had the introduction of environmental concerns in the operations management agenda. And in this paper, for example, the authors consider greening the supply chain, as you can see here, greening the supply chain as a key area to obtain greener operations management. Questions such as how do environmental issues impact supply chain management, tools, practices, is just-in-time a green approach to sustainable to supply chain management? So these are the questions that emerged decades ago and that make the case to introduce green issues in the research agenda of operations management. And since this initial debate, the field of green supply chains has evolved. So green supply chain management is an area and the definition that means the inclusion of environmental practices, tools into the whole supply chain. So we are not only talking about the greening of the main company, the focal company of a supply chain. We are talking about the greening of suppliers, so upstream supply chains, and the greening of downstream supply chain. So we are talking about how to green all the members that are part of a supply chain and close the loop, avoiding waste in a supply chain. Of course, green supply chain is a field of research which relates to many other areas, other fields of knowledge. For example, green supply chain adopts concepts, inspiration, insight from industrial ecology, industrial symbiosis, environmental management systems, product stewardship, and extended producer responsibility, life cycle assessment, analysis, and the eco-design and design for the environment. And the idea is that these principles can apply to the whole supply chain. But what are the specific practices of green supply chain management? And in this paper, published in one of the most important journals in operations management in the world, authors have proposed, have suggested a group of green supply chain management practices. For example, the first practice is internal environmental management. The second one is green purchasing, cooperation with customers, eco-design, and investment recovery. For example, in investment recovery, if a company has used the materials, they can be sent to a better destination, and the company can make money. Cooperation with customers, how to include what customers want in terms of green issues, green management, into product development and the company's environmental mission. So in this paper, you can find not only the green supply chain management practices, but also how to measure them. However, discussing green supply chains is not enough. We need to move forward and to debate the contribution of supply chains to sustainable development. So a new concept emerged, which is sustainable supply chains. So it's no longer about generic definitions of supply chain management or green supply chains. It's much more about sustainable supply chains nowadays. For example, in one of the most cited articles in the history of Journal of Cleaner Production, the authors offered a definition of sustainable supply chain, which is the management of material, information, capital flows, as well as cooperation among companies along the supply chain, while taking goals from all three dimensions of sustainable development: the economic, environmental, and the social aspects of the definition of sustainable development, but taking into account customers and stakeholders' requirements. So you can see the definition of sustainable supply chain here is much more comprehensive. It talks about the economic, environmental, and social balance and how to include stakeholders while managing a supply chain. And as you can see here, there are many triggers, motivations to companies start thinking about sustainable supply chains. So generally, a more sustainable supply chain start being designed when the focal company, the company which has power, bargaining power in a supply chain, start feeling the pressure from the government, customers, stakeholders, from law to become more sustainable. And then this focal company start motivating suppliers and the whole supply chain to be more sustainable. Now I will provide you with some empirical evidence developed by my research group on green and sustainable supply chains. So, for example, in this paper published in EJOR, we understood the most important variables to select green suppliers. So when a focal company wants to have a greener supply chain, this company will need to work with greener suppliers. So how to select green suppliers? So we studied this and we discovered that companies take into account if the top management team of the supplier is really concerned about green issues, if the supplier is really investing on eco design, and whether or not the supplier is following the law and the green regulation. So these criteria tend to be very relevant to select suppliers based on green supply chain management practices. In another paper in this article, we provide empirical evidence to defend that indeed quality management in companies tend to affect the environmental management maturity, so the level of maturity management of those companies, which in turn affect the adoption of green supply chain management practices and the performance of firms. As you can see here, we have quality management affecting environmental management level, the adoption of green supply chain management practices, and the green performance of firms. In another paper I would like to discuss with you, we focused on critical success factors and the green supply chain management proactivity. So, what are the critical success factors related to green supply chain proactivity? And we related, for example, critical factors such as green information management, total involvement of employees, etc., and how these factors relate to green supply chains maturity levels. And we discovered that the soft side of organizations really matters. For example, recruitment and selection, training, rewards related to green issues really support the creation of a green supply chain management strategy. In another paper, colleagues and I discussed how companies which want to have a more sustainable supply chain by investing on eco innovations and the low carbon innovations. And we try to understand the most important human critical success factors of this process. So we discovered, for example, that in this case, this company was the best company for green innovations, low carbon innovations, and was really motivating all the supply chain towards a more sustainable supply chain. And at the same time, this company was the company with the best management of critical success human factors, such as training, empowerment, organizational learning. So, of course, the technology side of sustainable supply chains is important. However, the soft side of organizations is equally relevant. So, we have been discussing supply chains, green supply chains, and that nowadays the debate is much more about sustainable supply chains. But then we are in a different context. We are in a context in which smart technologies are launched every day. So, how can Industry 4.0 emerging technologies really unlock the full potential of sustainable supply chains? So, I would like to talk to you about this research agenda. And of course, if you are interested into developing further any of these questions, please contact me. So supply chains tend to be transformed by Industry 4.0 technologies. So it's an ongoing process, and the adoption of emerging technologies such as Internet of Things, advanced robotics, blockchain, big data can really unlock faster, more accurate, more flexible, efficient, automated, and greener supply chains. For example, nowadays you can find blockchains applied technology applied across whole supply chains to ensure that there is transparency in terms of how information is managed, how to monitor sustainable impacts in a supply chain. And I believe that these technologies can not only improve the economic performance of companies and supply chains, but also play a vital role in moving forward what we understand by sustainability in supply chains. So the questions that we do need more research are, for example, will Industry 4.0 technologies unlock truly sustainable chains? So how to relate Industry 4.0 technologies and sustainable supply chains so we can enhance the performance of sustainable supply chains? What are the critical factors of the integration of supply chains and the Industry 4.0 technologies? And I'm talking about critical factors in terms of technology and the soft side of organizations. So in this question, from this question, you can have a number of insights useful for your PhD research, master dissertation. Will emerging technologies such as blockchain enhance the transparency of sustainable supply chains? How will Industry 4.0 technologies enhance the sustainability of multi-tier supply chains when you have, very complex supply chains, generally global supply chains, when you have not only the focal company and the supplier upstream supply chain, but you have suppliers of suppliers of suppliers operating in different regions of the world. So how to monitor sustainability and how to enhance sustainability of suppliers through Industry 4.0 technologies, this is a big topic. What are the challenges of integrating Industry 4.0 technologies and sustainability in emerging markets? We are talking about markets which face institutional voids or regulatory voids. So, there are challenges regarding governance. Sometimes the law is not up to date. So, how to bring this debate regarding the integration of Industry 4.0 technologies and sustainability of supply chains in emerging markets or emerging economies, and how to manage innovation in sustainable supply chains supported by Industry 4.0 technologies. What kind of suppliers interaction with, for example, universities, labs, your company will need to really unlock the adoption of sustainable supply chains 4.0. So you can see that these are complex questions. There are no easy answers, and they make really good topic for future PhD projects. These are the reference which supported this presentation. And thank you very much for your attention. I hope you enjoyed the research agenda suggested by this presentation. And if you feel that, these questions interesting, could lead you to a nice PhD project or master's dissertation, please do contact me. Thank you very much. Thank you for being interested in the University of Lincoln and the Lincoln International Business School. Thank you.